Welcome to part 3 in our series on the American Revolution. Last time we talked about causes of the Revolutionary War. This time we're talking about the differences between Loyalists and Patriots, British and Americans. So break out the teen crumpets and turn on some NASCAR, because we're turning left for learning.
Today we're going to start by talking about Loyalists and Patriots. Loyalists were those people who remained loyal to the king, while Patriots were those who wanted independence from the king. This sounds like a great spot to do a compare and contrast. Both groups were colonists. Loyalists and Patriots were those living in the colonies. They just had different opinions on who should be winning the war. Most Loyalists worked for the king or benefited from the status quo, or things remaining the same, while the Patriots, they tended to lead boycotts and protests to try to make change happen. Both of these groups faced harassment if they lived in an area dominated by the other side. Patriots, most had to fight in the army, while the Loyalists, only some had to, because the British Army was well trained and they had plenty of soldiers. Both tried to convince others to join, although the Loyalists started giving up and going back to Britain, while the Patriots were led by the Sons of Liberty and the Continental Congress. So two very different sides of these groups involved in the Revolutionary War, both of their reasons why they believed what they believed and did what they did. On the battlefield, these two groups changed into the British and American armies, which were very different in their advantages and disadvantages. Let's take a look at these two sides with this versus that. Today with this versus that, we have on one side the American army, and on the other side the British army, both with their strengths and weaknesses. Let's start by taking a look at the strengths of the American army. First, there was home field advantage. The Americans knew where they were going and how to get there. Unlike the British, they knew where to get help. They could recruit new troops from across the countryside. The British, on the other hand, were thousands of miles away from home. They had to get troops mostly from Britain, as most Loyalists were not trained to fight in the King's army. Of course, one of the strengths of the British was their navy, which was the most powerful in the world. The U.S. never really had a navy to speak of. But luckily for the Americans, they would get help from France, who had the second largest navy in the world to help win the war. Now when the British were running low on their soldiers, they had their wealth to hire some more. They chose to hire the Hessians, the most notorious mercenaries in the world. The British didn't need to do this very often, however, because they had lots of well-trained soldiers and all the supplies they needed. American soldiers were not well-trained and lacked food and supplies until the war ended. What Americans did have was a brilliant leader in George Washington. He may have lost some battles, but he won the ones that mattered and inspired his men. The leaders of the British Army were well-trained and knowledgeable, but they underestimated the Americans time and time again. Of course, being a British officer wasn't the easiest job in the world. Your soldiers were only fighting for a paycheck. The Americans, on the other hand, were fighting for families, homes, and ultimately their freedom. So what? If you can answer the following questions, then you'll learn what you needed to know. Who were the Loyalists and Patriots, and what were the differences between them? What were the strengths of the British and American armies? And finally, what were the weaknesses of the British and American armies? Tune in next time when we talk about major battles of the war and how it ended.